Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm your host, Matthew Petrusik. Today we are excited to bring you the first part of a discussion that Bishop Barron recently had with Dr. Todd Warner on the way a Catholic should approach the crossroads of religion and politics. Enjoy.
On November 19, 1863, as the towering yet stooped Abraham Lincoln peered across the killing fields of Gettysburg, he declared, quote, "It is for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." Close quote. Lincoln's challenge was to save democracy. As we see it today, was it worth it? Bishop Robert Barron, in this most political of years on democracy, the good, the bad, and the ugly, now. What is democracy? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, Bishop Barron, these, of course, are the words written by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, which was adopted by the Continental Congress July 4th, 1776. So there's a lot to unpack in these three very weighty sentences. And I want to say just a few self-evident truths. All men created equal, endowed by a Creator, inalienable rights, government by the consent of the governed. So let's begin with just a general question. What is democracy, and why does it, albeit imperfectly, work?
Yeah, two good questions, searching questions, and in a way hard to answer. I mean, you could say very simply, democracy ruled by the demos, by the people. Yeah. Suppose, go back to classical thought, an aristocracy ruled by the best, or a monarchy ruled by one, a timocracy ruled by the kind of military forces, oligarchy ruled by the wealthy, democracy ruled by the people, by the demos. And that's one feature of it, obviously, and you hear it reflected there in Jefferson, that the government derives its powers from the consent of the governed, power coming up from below, so to speak, not from on high, let's say divine right of king sort of ruling. So that's a feature of it, to be sure. The famous Lincoln triplet there, that, Gettysburg, of the people, by the people, for the people. It's been commented that the first of those is a bit of a banality, I suppose. What else would it be government of except the people? We're not governing plants and animals. So yes, of course, it's a government of the people. Also, the third one, for the people, is not really a distinctive element, because the classical authors would say, a good monarchy is for the people. A good aristocracy is for the people. Even a good oligarchy, you might say, for the common good. So for the people, sure, that could be any government. The decisive one maybe is the middle one, by the people. And there's that idea of majoritarianism and of the powers of government being derived from the people. The people themselves are the source of authority and so on. That maybe that's the decisive thing. But I would add, and again, now with Jefferson in mind, and the beginning of the Declaration, the Bill of Rights, all of that in mind, democracy is not just majoritarianism. It's also things like an acknowledgement of human rights. Given, mind you, and I've said this over and over again, not by the government, but by God, endowed by their Creator. So an acknowledgement of something objective and indeed sacred about the rights of individuals. The freedom, dignity, and equality of the individual, that seems to be part of a democratic sensibility. Equality of opportunity, equality before and under the law. And then go into the Bill of Rights, following from human dignity, things like freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of the press and so on. I'd say, and then, I also would add, limited government, I think, is really key to a democratic sensibility. And that, too, is a deeply religious idea, if you press it, I think. Ultimate power does not belong to any form of human government, that there's a power beyond the power of government. And therefore, government can and should be limited. Checks and balances within a political system, but also elements within the wider society, like a free press, for example, like mediating institutions, religious and otherwise, that provide a sort of check and balance to government. I would say, Todd, all of that and more would be included in the definition of democracy. So beyond just rule by the people, it's all those elements make up a democracy, I think.
Extraordinary. And the way you describe it, it talks about what a delicate balance it is.
Yes.
It's an extraordinary thing that this could be something that could be devised in the mind of human beings and made to work. And obviously we're going to talk about some of the deficits we come in the practice of democracy, but it is something that is cultivated, as you've mentioned, with just great care, lest things fall askew.
You know, it just crossed my mind as you were saying that. When I was studying political philosophy back at Catholic University many years ago, Robert Sokolowski, who was my great mentor, gave us a year-long seminar in political philosophy. Everyone from Plato through, Marx and everything. And I remember he said one time, it's a quasi-miracle, the coming together of impossibly talented people at the same time and same place. When you think Adams and Jefferson and Franklin and Hamilton, maybe especially, John Jay, where else in the world with that extraordinary coming together of very fine minds? Madison, I mean, think this thing through. And they made a system comprising all these elements that did survive, has survived. Now, I love that you began with Lincoln, because there's the moment when, as Lincoln says at Gettysburg, right, this great Civil War we're in is testing whether any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. The question was, so 87 years after the founding, will it work? Because say what you want about the Civil War, one thing it meant was the system fell apart. The democratic system fell apart. We tried 1820 compromise, 1850 compromise, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. I mean, Henry Clay and Calhoun and Webster, the greatest statesmen we had, trying to work through this problem of slavery. It didn't work. The system fell apart. And Lincoln fought the war to testing whether that nation could long endure. So that's a very interesting thing. We have endured. And rightly, Lincoln gets a lot of praise because that's his great achievement, freeing of the slaves and knitting back together this country that had fallen apart.
Right.
So we've got that in our political DNA as Americans, as we're the great advocates of democracy, but our system fell apart. And we fought a horrible war, a catastrophic war. 600,000 people died because the system fell apart. And now we did knit it back together. But I guess the point I'm making in this sort of rambling way is it's a precarious business. This marvelous thing that the Founding Fathers put together, but it's a precarious business and has to be attended to all the time.
I think it was George Will that once said he was being waggish in his comment, but he was talking about people talking about how easy democracy is to be just picked up and implemented somewhere else. And he said, well, look at the American experience. He says all it took was 5 geniuses and 200 years of self-rule. I mean, and he was obviously saying that it isn't that easy. There was, like you said, there's an extraordinary intellectual heft that goes into the consideration of democracy, and then there's the gritty, dirty, ugly practice of it, working your way through that culminates, as you've said, in a civil war. That anybody would say, it's amazing to think that we could come to the other side of a civil war as a nation that was whole without festering. And there's still antagonisms, obviously, but festering to antagonisms that would make it impossible for us to go forward.
The point you just made, citing Will, I think there was really important. I think even a lot of Americans forget it. That when those geniuses gathered in 1776 and later in 1787 for the Constitutional Convention, we've had 200 years of, call it, nascent democracy on these shores. So the first settlers coming over late 16th, early 17th century. It's 200 years of the House of Burgess and community organizations and self-government. We had this marvelous culture, you might say, of a nascent democracy that made possible that moment. That's why you and I both, of course, lived through this. when George W. Bush, I think with very good intentions, saying, we're going to plant democracy in the Middle East, and they're going to greet our troops with flowers, and there's going to be a springtime of democracy. Well, in our American hearts, we say, yeah, that's great, but there wasn't a culture in place that could receive that.
Right.
And I think we overlook that sometimes, that we think it's just a given. It's like a Platonic form.
Yeah.
Of course, democracy, everyone was going to love. Well, it's empirically not the case, certainly. And then the cultural prerequisite for the acceptance of democracy, even we Americans overlook that, I think.
So democracy, as we were alluding to here, has quite a history. It stretches across ancient Athens and Republican Rome to medieval Europe and even indigenous America. It's associated with guilds and assemblies, parliaments and city-states. There's seismic moments in the history of democracy, including the penning of the Magna Carta, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the waging of revolutionary wars, the advent of even decolonization. What is it about democracy that has made its appeal so enduring over so much time and across such diverse cultures?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, as we just said, it's not universally the case by any means. I mean, across history and to the present day, there are an awful lot of people that don't think organizing society in this manner is a good idea. But I think, to your point, there is something about it that is grounded properly in an appreciation of human nature. The rights, freedom, and dignity of the individual, which I would argue is a religious idea. It comes up out of the Bible, that idea. I think that conditions democracy at its best, and I think it appeals to people because they know that that's true. The capacity for self-rule is also grounded in a deep respect for the dignity and freedom of the individual. That's congruent with your dignity that you be able to govern your own life. I think the sense of limited government, I think that appeals to people's keen sense that, like it or not, we human beings tend to go bad. So you put someone in power, all right, we recognize the need for that, but he's going to go bad, she's going to go bad in some way. And so they've got to be checked, balanced, watched carefully. I think that appeals to people's sense of, that's correct. The fact, free elections, if we don't like the way someone's doing it, they can be tossed out. Go back to Jefferson too, and this is something George Will observed. He said the most important word in that preamble to the Declaration is secure. Governments exist to secure these rights. The rights are independent of government. They don't come from government. They don't come from any human institution. They come from God. And I'll take Jefferson at his word. They come from God. Government exists under God to secure those rights. That appeals, I think, to people's sense of, that's right. So in all those ways, I think, objectively speaking, it's an attractive system. It's a morally good system. And that appeals to people. Now, I'm a Newman man. Why do people assent to things? Argument's got something to do with it. So I've just made an argument, if you want. All right. But assent is rarely a matter of just accepting an argument. There's all those cultural pieces and experiential pieces and prejudice and all that has to be taken into consideration of why someone would say, yes, that's the system for me. But I think there are a lot of objective reasons why it's proven to be very attractive.
One of the things you made me think about was, I read this somewhere about Karl Marx devising the Communist Manifesto, sat in the dusty stacks of the British Library and concocted a theory that he wanted reality to comport to. Whereas Adam Smith, and I'm not speaking unfettered endorsement of Adam Smith and so on, but Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations after spending time down in the marketplace watching markets unfold. And to some extent, as you're describing it, that democracy in its best form seems to be something that adheres to or respects the way human beings have sort of done things over time. It's a recognition of customs that are there that then we we codify existing customs, as opposed to, I got a great new idea. It's going to require a lot of change for a lot of people into something you're not, and maybe we might have a lot of deaths in the process, but it's a better way of going about it. So again, the notion of democracy recognizing human nature and customs, as opposed to some of the utopian ideologies out there that say, I've got a better way of cramming human nature into this vice and making it something anew.
It's the best description there of like British common law coming up out of that kind of tradition. Here's an analogy. It's kind of stupid, but it comes to my mind a lot. I heard it many years ago. And you're designing a college campus, let's say, and you want to put sidewalks in. What should you do? Well, don't just put the sidewalks in. No, let the campus live for a while and see where the kids naturally walk. All right, there's the path they've naturally made. Put the sidewalk there.
Sure.
So it's the institution following the practice.
Right.
And your point about Marx and Adam Smith, I think that's very good. And go back to the very beginning of philosophy, Plato and Aristotle. Plato is much more the forms, and here's the right way to do it, and let's fit people into this philosophical system. Aristotle's much more the Adam Smith instinct of, okay, how do people actually speak and behave?
Right.
And what's the soul? Well, watch people in action. Who's the good man? Or no, rather, what's the right thing to do? Well, find the good man and do what he does.
Yes.
That's the Aristotelian instinct. And I think you're absolutely right. That's a good democratic instinct, is to say, all right, what is human nature? How does it actually unfold on the ground? And let's make institutions that kind of complement that or rise up naturally from that.
And to correct also myself, it doesn't mean there aren't correctives that need to be put in place or
of course,
guardrails
right.
and so on. But so some customs are bad, and we need to kind of
Yes.
But the issue is trying to find what's the best way to go about doing that.
Well, and there's something too about democracy that is really wonderful. It stands opposed to totalitarianism. So there is a temptation. It goes right back to Plato. And here I'm following Karl Popper, the open society and its enemies. And maybe he's unfair to Plato, but he blames Plato for that great tradition of totalitarianism. That I'm the philosopher, I figured this out, here's the way to do it. I'm now going to impose this vision absolutely on everybody, governing every aspect of life. And the anti-totalitarian instinct, which I share immensely, is no. Giving people a wide range for their own freedom, and government intervening only when really absolutely necessary, not micromanaging or hyper-directing society, but giving plenty of room for freedom. And that's that idea of limited government. We don't want these grand totalitarian systems. They're dangerous. And any of us who've inherited, the history of the 20th century, we know that.
Yep.
Because we struggled, our parents and grandparents struggled quite literally with horrible forms of totalitarianism. So, 3 cheers for democracy that stand against that system.
I wanted to, so Freedom House is this Washington nonprofit organization that goes back to the 40s. It looks at the state of democracy, political freedom, human rights around the world. And this index called the Economist Democracy Index looks at grades for various systems or countries that have electoral processes, civil liberties, function of government, et cetera. It's shocking to read that in 2023, the Economist Democracy Index said that only 7.8% of the world's population, that is 24 countries, are defined as full democracies.
Yeah.
Close to 40% are flawed. And the rest, over 50%, are either hybrid regimes or authoritarian states. And you just mentioned the 20th century experience. And it made me wonder, why after all these years, after the Second World War with the fight against Nazism and fascism, why after the fall of the despotic Soviet communism, why are less than half of the world's population still living in anti-democratic, if not authoritarian regimes?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very searching question. And I suppose we've been kind of singing the praises of democracy here for the past many minutes, which is good. It's appropriate, it seems to me. I think we'll get maybe to some of the negativity of it because, we mentioned Lincoln. We both have Churchill as a hero too. Churchill and Lincoln were at one and the same time great singers of the song of democracy and very clear-eyed and very realistic about its limitations. Again, Lincoln saying, look, this thing fell apart. Right? If they were such geniuses and our system is so good, why did it fall apart tragically and catastrophically? Churchill, and everyone knows the famous quote is, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. But it's typical Churchillian, wit. But to start with, boy, this is a limited system, and this is a deeply problematic system. It is. It is. And I get across human history. Look at the Roman Empire. So let's say Rome begins as a kingship, and then a republic for many centuries, but then that goes through a crisis, and then for centuries is an imperial system. You had some very bright people, operating who never thought for a minute what we're calling like liberal democracy was a good idea. And the same is true around the world today, not only like in the communist countries, but many of the Islamic countries and so on. Democracy, as we're describing it, would strike them as a very bad idea indeed.
Right.
And to be fair, democracy is not praised by the classical authors. Rule by the demos would strike Plato as a very bad idea.
Yeah.
Rule by the mob, the demos, the ordinary people. Aristotle would say there's a type, he called it polity, with some of the elements that we mean by democracy. But polity will devolve very quickly into democracy in the crude sense. The ordinary people, they don't know right from wrong. They don't know left from right, most of them. You tell me they're going to run the society? Where for both those gentlemen, something like an aristocracy ruled by the best and the brightest struck them as the right way to do it. So my point here is, for all kinds of reasons, I think people, ancient, medieval, modern, contemporary, would say, I'm not so sure about democracy.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure about it. Does it really work? It's had catastrophic failures. And maybe we'll get in more detail to the negative side, but I don't want to be entirely dismissive of, let's say, half the world that doesn't quite see it that way.
Right.
Even as I remain, I think, like Lincoln and Churchill, a singer of the song of democracy. But I also get the shadow side.
Let's dive a little. We've been talking a lot about democracy in general. We've moved into American democracy. We know all modern democracies have their own political and cultural nuances. America is no exception to that. So the structure of American democracy is based on the Declaration of Independence, which, according to Lincoln, as I've done more reading on Lincoln, he really, really championed the Declaration as a vital founding document about equality and freedom. But also there's the Constitution. The Constitution, as you know, erects three branches of government, a federal and state dichotomy, a Bill of Rights. You have the Federalist Papers, where there's a conversation between Hamilton, Jay, and Madison defining and defending the Constitution. And in the Federalist Papers, which everybody should read, by the way, it's very interesting because I watched something with Anton Scalia speaking to high school students, and the teacher said, well, which of the Federalist Papers should they read? And he said,
all of them.
All of them.
Yeah, right.
So James Madison says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and the next place oblige it to control itself. So looking specifically at American democracy and the founders' design rooted in political philosophy and faith and custom and so on, what does the structure of American democracy say to you about the founders' understanding of human nature?
A lot, but there's so much we could say about this. We've been talking about demos, ruled by the people, and that's a very broad, even crude, definition. Because I think what you find in our founders is what Aquinas would have called mixed government, and Aquinas is borrowing there from Aristotle. Here's what we mean. For Thomas Aquinas, the ideal government in a Platonic world, the best government would be a monarchy. You get one really good, smart, virtuous person who is governing for the sake of the common good and always chooses the virtuous and right path. Aquinas says the singularity of the monarch is a great advantage because, okay, do it. Make it so, and it happens.
Right.
More to it, Aquinas says, it mimics the governance of God because the whole universe is governed by one great monarch, God and his providence. So the king should be kind of a mirror of God governing society. But Aquinas immediately adds, all right, I know that's the ideal, but it's exceptionally difficult to find and then to control such a person. So he says, the realistic best is something like a mixed government. Mixed meaning a combination of the monarchical, so the unity of command and vision, but also the aristocratic, so they rule by a cultured elite, and elements of the democratic. Because indeed Aquinas would hold to that principle that what concerns everyone should be voted upon by everybody, All right, 1, 2, 3, monarch, aristocracy, democracy. Now, the medievals come up into the early modern period through people like Richard Hooker, who was the great Anglican divine, late 16th, I think he died very early 17th century, Elizabethan figure, deeply indebted to the scholastics. Every one of our founders would have read Hooker. Newman in the 19th century he calls him the judicious hooker, that he's this great mind, They would have gotten that idea of mixed government from him. I mean, the founders, our founders. Another link, it's interesting. I'm not sure it's right, but Jefferson certainly had Robert Bellarmine in his library. Robert Bellarmine, great Catholic, theologian, would have mediated to our founders something of that scholastic vision. I think unmistakably in our Constitution, when you have the president, who's something like a monarch, the Senate, which is something like an aristocratic society, the House, which it's elected every 2 years, represents the demos, the people. You don't have democracy in a sort of Rousseauian sense of let's have everybody in a big plebiscite vote on every issue. We don't have that. We have a representative Republican form. And it mimics, I think, the mixed government idea that you find in Aquinas. Now, built into that is checks and balances. Each one checking and balancing. And no, you're too far. Nope, you can't say that.
Yes.
Which in turn is born of a deeply biblical vision of the human being as flawed and fallen and liable to be unjust, right? If you think human beings are perfectible, and Aristotle, in his worst moments, I think, might have had that idea, and just with enough virtue and enough knowledge, you can. Biblical people don't believe that for a second. We're very attentive to the fact that we are flawed and fallen. Therefore, hem everybody in. Give power. George Washington, talk about the virtuous man. That's another miracle of our founding, actually. Washington was not the theoretician that Madison and Hamilton and Jefferson were, but he was the virtuous man. He was like the Aristotelian, good man. All right, but even George Washington, make sure there's a Senate and a House, and he can veto and all that, but they're hemming each other in. I love that about the Founding Fathers. The insistence upon rights, freedom, dignity, that's biblical. So is this. And they were ambiguously biblical, our founders, to varying degrees.
Sure.
But it was in the air they breathed. It was just the culture they took in. And I think those are super healthy features of our democracy.
That whole notion of tensions that you're describing there, which is extraordinary, the notion that human dignity is essential and, in our Catholic perspective, inviolable, ineradicable. At the same time, duties come with rights. So there's rights and duties. Simultaneously, just the notion that the freedoms you have, but the restraints on those freedoms, the mercy that's offered, the justice that is required. Again, back to the delicate tensions that exist in this very, very it's a fragile product of the human mind. So it's an extraordinary thing.
You're getting at something there, it's a very important point, and I don't have a good resolution for it. One of my criticisms of the liberal democracy that emerged in our country, 18th century, is our government is, I would say, protective rather than directive. Classical thought, medieval thought, certainly saw the purpose of government was to direct the society towards certain moral ends. Our founders, for a lot of reasons, were skeptical of that. Like a lot of early moderns, they were skeptical of any claim to there is clearly the good, right? They construed a society that was more protective. So you've got basic rights. Government exists to secure those rights, right? Now, what about ultimate happiness? It's up to you. You have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as you see fit. But the classical tradition, they were massively interested in what happiness really is. Aquinas, Beatitudo, what is it? That's the most important question. Same with Aristotle. The virtuous life, what is that life? Our founders, I think partly was due to the pluralism of the society, were skeptical about naming ultimate ends. And the government, should not be involved in that business. So what happens is, happily, I think, we develop this sense of, well, that's what religion's for. And that's what other mediating institutions are for, to provide those ends. But it's not government's business to say, here's where this is the moral life you should be pursuing. Now, is that a limitation of liberal democracy? I would say yes, in many ways, because it's left so undefined and so open-ended what the good is. And especially when the religions now are so attenuating, when the religions are so compromised. Who's providing that vision? Now it's every teenager in America. I make it up. I decide what the good is. Don't tell me. That's, if you want liberalism run amok.
Mm-hmm.
It's the liberalism of the early and mid 18th century now run amok. Right. What they had in Adam's day and Washington's day and all that was a strong sense of religion, that religion was providing these ultimate ends. And so government didn't have to do it. Government shouldn't get involved in that.
Right.
We're at a very interesting moment now, I think, when the religions are weakened. And now it devolves upon the individual just to make that decision.
In 1947, reflecting on the mixed blessing of democracy, Winston Churchill quipped, as you said earlier, quote, "Many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." Close quote. And British playwright George Bernard Shaw warned darkly, "Democracy is a device that ensures we shall be governed no better than we deserve." So Bishop, as you said, we were lauding the merits of democracy in our first segments. Now we have to get to some of the gritty, dirty, day in and day out downsides that we see with democracy.
Yeah.
So it can be downright messy, and I want to talk about some of the things that can go wrong. So I got to return to Churchill again, the eminently quotable Churchill, who once lamented, "The best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter." So first of all, Bishop, what is democracy to do with the uninformed or indifferent voter?
Yeah, no, they're good questions. And go back to Jefferson, who, to his credit, saw, if this is going to work, this thing we're describing, you have to have a well-informed and educated electorate. If you have people that are completely uninterested in politics, uninformed about it, they'll be terrible voters. And hence public schools had to be instituted. So he got that, And Jefferson could be a bit of a romantic about democracy. Hamilton is a balance to him there, Madison too, in a way. But that's one answer, is we have to be dedicated to education. And we can't allow people to fall into, ignorance of political matters. But I get Churchill's point. And who would have agreed with it very much? Plato and Aristotle would have said, what do you mean, government by the common person? When you read Plato, what do you sense is the Athenian democracy. Oh yeah, wasn't that great? It killed Socrates. The best guy that ever lived, ever was, Socrates.
Right.
They killed him.
Right.
Out of stupidity and out of passion of the mob. And so now read the Republic as Plato's attempt to say, by God, that should never happen again. Yeah. Right? And so, he would have shared with Churchill, like, what do you mean the demos? Giving them rule? They're idiots. They should do what they're told, Same with Aristotle, to be fair. He would have said something like an aristocracy or rule by the moral and intellectual elite. And, well, yeah, I guess why not? I mean, I get the best, the best. Get them to run the society. But the average person, in fact, Aristotle would have seen them as largely staying out of politics. He would divide the public and the private. So most people, all women, he thought, children, and most males too, should stay in the private realm of the household. And that's okay. That's where they belong. Slaves belong there too. But only the aristoi should go out into the public space and start making decisions about, sure, that's Churchill's idea of talk to the average person, you'll be pretty dissatisfied. Now, a lot happened between Plato and Aristotle and the founding of our country, and a lot of things that we just talked about. But no, I get it. I mean, the shadow side of it has been on display from time immemorial.
There's a great line from William F. Buckley, which I'll brutalize here, but he says, "I'd rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston phone book than the entire faculty at Harvard." And I think the point, him being that the flip side of that argument is there is a common sense, customary, religious sensibility, what have you, that goes with living your daily life in Boston. That gets lost by the dreaming, overly theoretical, hyper utopian, ideological minds of a Harvard faculty. God bless all our Harvard faculty out there. But so the point is, there's the danger of the uninvested, uneducated voter. But that can be improved upon by an engagement. There's a danger of the overeducated, hyper theoretical,
Yes.
utopian, and so on.
It's really good, this point, and worth musing on. Because Buckley, you're quite right, is making the opposite point.
Right.
So the Aristoi, the best, wouldn't that be, let's say the political science majors from Harvard and the professors at Yale, wouldn't they be the best? I'm mindful of, I don't know if you're a Simpsons fan, but the episode, remember when Lisa decides, well, Springfield should be run by the smartest people. So she and comic book guy and Principal Skinner and the nutty professor and, the smartest people. Well, of course, it was a complete disaster. It was an utter disaster, So that's the opposite instinct.
Right.
And, I would share that too, to a large degree. Jefferson had this sort of mystical confidence in, the yeoman farmer and the average person. And there's a lot to be said for that.
Right.
We have that debate today between the kind of coastal elites and the rest of the country. That same debate is being played out. Again, I think the genius of our founders was the checks and the balances and the both and, we don't have a strict democracy. We have this representative, republicanism. We don't have a strict Rousseauian plebiscite-based democracy. We have a checks and balances system and all that. So I think they were aware of these built-in tensions. And again, Churchill's a good example because it's the same Churchill that said that also knows it's the best option on the table.
Right.
But he said it without dewy-eyed romanticism. He was clear-eyed about its limitations, even as he said, this is the best, So that's the right space to be in. That Churchillian space, I think, is the best.
And I think to your point, I think at the end of the day, the answer somewhat is live in the tensions.
Yes.
Live in, that we were not going to resolve all these tensions. There's got to be some free play, if you will. It's sort of like, as I like to say from a musical scene, you have your sheet music, but when you play jazz, you step away from the sheet music.
Yes.
As long as you don't go too far, obviously.
Right. Yeah, it's a subtle dance. And again, to be fair, that dance fell apart in 1861. And boy, they tried. That's the right way to tell American history from, let's say, the Constitutional Convention till 1861 was an attempt to deal with this problem of slavery.
Right.
And as I say, the best and brightest in our country tried, and the dance continued awkwardly, and then it fell apart. And then we did need this genius and this moral hero, Abraham Lincoln, to knit it together. See, what if Lincoln had never emerged? What if the best we could do was like James Buchanan? Our country would have fallen apart.
Yeah.
We'd be a bunch of banana republics.
Yeah.
It took a genius, both a political and moral genius, Lincoln, to knit it back together. But that's a very interesting story. And it's the beauty and the frailty of democracy were both on display.
In 1887, Lord Acton famously wrote, as many know, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men, even when they exercise influence and not authority. Still more when you superadd the tendency or the certainty of corruption by authority. So how much corruption, this is almost, it's rhetorical, but how much corruption do we see in democracy?
Well, plenty. No, but plenty. But they knew it from the beginning. They knew it, which is why they built in these balances. We haven't mentioned the press very much yet, but at its best, the press functions that way in a free society.
Yeah.
That you've got this watchdog that is keeping an eye on these people and asking penetrating questions, and okay, fair enough. Now, I want to always add, well, then who watches the press? Right. Because I don't want to give them complete
Where's their check, if you will?
What checks the press? So yes, but that's the genius of our system. And when I say system, I don't just mean the government. I mean the whole society is predicated upon this assumption that people tend to go bad.
Yeah.
That is a biblical assumption. Take the Bible out. Look, you've got schemas of perfectibility in the classical world, for sure. You got them in the modern world. So many of the modern philosophers felt if we just make these reforms, we can. Marx is a prime example of that. Marxism is a scheme of perfectibility. That, to me, is one of the great pillars of what I'd call a conservative view of the world that I would share is, no. God perfects us at the eschaton. Prior to that, it's going to be a bit of a mess.
Yeah.
I always liked Thomas Sowell's intuition that we should never speak about solutions to problems. We should speak about ameliorating the situation, or doing what we can.
Yeah.
Because when you say the solution, duck.
Yeah. Pretty absolute.
Because someone's going to say, okay, that's the solution. You don't like it, I'm going to put you in jail, or I'm going to kill you because you're getting in the way of the solution.
Right.
I think I'll say a genius of Jefferson, Madison, and company, Hamilton especially, they knew that.
Yeah.
They knew that. There's no solution. There's this rickety and sometimes very unreliable, sometimes gerrymandered system of checks and balances, which is probably the best we can do.
Yeah. In Gulliver's Travels, Jonathan Swift said, "You've clearly proved that ignorance, idleness, and vice are the proper ingredients for qualifying a legislature. So how are we to cope with the inefficiency of democracy?"
Yes, and that's another way to look at the limitation of democracy.
Yeah.
And I get that. I've lived through it all my life. What's one of the words most often used of Congress is gridlock.
Yeah.
All my life. Don't believe people that say, oh, now there's gridlock. There's always been gridlock. In my experience watching American politics. When I was a kid, the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress. But then, we elected Richard Nixon, and then Gerald Ford's president, and of course Reagan comes in, and it shifts around. Gridlock is a shadow side of democracy. Look at the British system. Look at parliamentary systems, especially. They're trying to cobble together governments from warring factions within the parliament. Look at Israel. Look at Italy. Is all these governments succeeding each other? Yeah, I get it. And that's why, Plato saw this, is when democracies get really unruly and gridlocked, in comes the strong man on horseback.
Right.
Like, all right, look, I'm going to solve this thing.
Right.
So famously, Napoleon in the wake of the French Revolution. And so the French go right back to an absolute monarchy after they threw one over. But it was so chaotic, the democratic system, that Napoleon emerges. Hitler famously after the Weimar Republic. There's all kinds of examples of it, of the strong man on horseback.
Yeah.
And I get why that's attractive. Or look at like in a Russian system. So when I was a kid, communism, and many would point out that, look, put Marx out of the equation, you have, an autocratic authoritarian system, which the Russians have had for centuries and centuries. Well, then they throw off the communist system, and we have Boris Yeltsin and Glasnost and all this reform and democracy. Well, before you know it, Vladimir Putin, who's just like a czar, is back in power. All right, their culture kind of tends in that direction, So it's the complexity of these systems, but I think the corruption within democracy, the danger of gridlock. Yeah. I get why people say, "All right, I've had it with that. It's not going to work."
The one last before we move to our next segment, in 1923, and you mentioned Adolf Hitler. In 1923, he attempted to violently overthrow the Weimar Republic through the beer hall putsch. He failed, and then 10 years later, having moved the Nazi Party into the political system, he was elected chancellor, and through the Enabling Act, granted supreme power of the state, a democratic process that led Hitler into power, not a violent putsch. So shouldn't we be concerned that democracies can elect evil people?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. And that's why they've got to be checked, and we have to be aware of that danger. It's kind of a miracle of our system. Now, I know the Civil War, we've talked about it several times, it did fall apart, but it's been kind of remarkable.
Yeah.
We've had military figures as presidents, and again, God bless him, George Washington. One of the finest moments in the history of the West was George Washington, having won the Revolutionary War, still with his army intact, goes to I've been there, to the Maryland State House in Annapolis, beautiful colonial building, and resigned his commission, got on his horse alone, and rode back home to Mount Vernon. When George III heard about that, I love this story. George III, his great nemesis, the King of England, against whom he had rebelled, he heard that story. He said, he's the greatest man in the world.
Wow.
Because they hadn't seen that before. Yeah. No, you just won a war? You're the general? You got the army? Well, I'm king of America.
Right.
And there were plenty of people that wanted him to be king of America. God bless George Washington for having the humility to say, no, I did my duty. War's over. We won. I'm going home, And that set the tone, thank God. Whether it's Zachary Taylor, whether it's Ulysses S. Grant, whether it's Dwight Eisenhower.
Yeah.
You've got these great military figures. And in many other political settings would have said, oh, all right, let's call the army back together.
Yeah.
And I'm now the emperor of America.
Yeah.
God bless them. Look at someone like Douglas MacArthur, who at one time was considered a candidate for the presidency. But it was Washington's example, I think, that has gotten deep in our DNA politically. But yeah, we have to watch our elected officials, and we have to be aware of that tendency toward corruption. Absolutely.
Matthew Petrusic here again. Thanks so much for joining us on the Word on Fire show. As always, if you'd like to learn more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ and become a better evangelist with and for others, visit institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. We'll see you next time, and God bless and protect you.